I welcome you. We are delighted to have you joining us for this time as we explore contemplative consciousness in a time of pandemic with our longtime friend and supporter, Don Bisson. We're delighted to have familiar faces and friends in the mix, as well as new faces and friends, folks we've never met, because we are co-journers on this way. So just a few words about Bread of Life. We are a 23-year-old small nonprofit, and our mission is cultivating practices that form and strengthen the spiritual dimension of life. Our focus is on practices of depth spiritual formation that frees participants to discover and offer their particular gifts into the world in ways that honor the desires of God's heart for the world. Believing that grace is an accident, but spiritual practice makes us accident prone, we trust that our commitment to contemplative practice in a context of loving mutual accountability helps participants become available to the work of transformation, inside and out. The inner life always flows into the outer and back into the inner. It's like the infinity symbol. Bread of Life entered our own time of deep listening for what the Spirit is inviting of us about 2 months before the pandemic. And what is rising from that discernment process to date is that tending the community of what Don will later speak to as social mystics is primary. So stay tuned and notice if this is something that draws you. We'll be sharing more, so we want to make sure that you're on list to receive constant contacts from us. We send them out maybe twice a month or so. So Don Bisson, a Marist brother, has long been a partner and supporter of Bread of Life and like work in the world. And this is probably his 6th benefit for us. It's a gift of stunning generosity that funds our scholarship program, because we mutually believe that this sort of work needs to be available to all who seek it. Don is a spiritual director and a specialist in the formation of spiritual directors, as well as a widely sought after speaker and retreat leader on the depth journey. With graduate degrees in liturgy and spirituality and transpersonal psychology, he earned his Doctor of Ministry at the Pacific School of Religion, specializing in spiritual direction and Jungian psychology. He has recorded over 90 retreats and topics that are available as CDs or MP3 downloads. I will be placing the website where you can go if you want to get CDs of this particular talk and topic today, and the many others that he has done. I will put that in chat and make that available to you, as well as in an email that will follow tomorrow. But what truly attracts people to Don is not just his academic credentialing. He speaks to what he has experienced. His perspective has been formed in the heat and in the pressure of the deep underground passage of his own healing journey in God. In other words, he walks the talk, and that's no small thing. Compassion for what it means to be human is the result, alongside clarity about the compelling call of the Spirit to wake up, and participate consciously in God's purposes in our world. It's what we're going to be opening today. Before I turn it over to Don, I'm going to pause, invite each of us to take a breath, shake off all the words, and offer a prayer poem written on May Day this spring. It points to the possibility in what our time reveals, should we choose to partner with the living Spirit. I'm going to put it up on our screen just briefly so that you can see it if you're somebody that likes to look at words visually as well as listen to it. The fertile unnameable. There's a stillness hovering, wings spread wide over chaos, brooding over the formless dark womb of all creating, waiting, waiting, waiting. Wordless and wondering, a question mark hangs suspended. The unsung song and the ungrieved grief pregnant in the world's belly, gestating the yet unseen, yearning toward the unrevealed. There are no words in this place, only the pulse, the throbbing pulse, heartbeat of the holy within and among, gathering strength, gathering life, gathering us into one magnificent, fertile breath for calling out the new creation. So with a breath in and a breath out, we say amen and welcome Brother Don.
Thank you. First of all, to say thank you for Sandra for setting this all up and making it possible for today. Obviously, her continued presence and effort to make Bread of Life continue and flourish has been part of her vocation for the last 23 years. I think one of the things we realized that the pandemic has not only affected economically our local restaurant and pub, but about every single structure there is in our society, including spiritual and religious institutions that already I've known 2 retreat houses now that are closing because of the pandemic, as well as 20 Catholic inner city schools that can't make it because of the finances of the people. And so religious institutions, spiritual institutions are also at risk. So making a day like this happen is part of the participation in trying to keep these entities open, because if these doors are not open, then the hearts can close. And this is a process. I know that most of you have listened to the workshop that I recorded a couple of weeks ago for this event. And that is basically the gut of what we're going to be talking about today. And so that was 4 hours of listening, and now 3 hours of processing what we have listened to, and ask the very important question of, all of this means nothing unless we bring it forward. What does this mean to put into action, to make a difference in my life or in the life of others? I guess during the time of pandemic, we've had to reassess and face reality in ways in which, normal living in denial didn't allow us to. Right now, you can't see where I am, but I'm in the basement of a house in the Bronx, New York. We are about 5 blocks from Montefiore Hospital, which was the epicenter in New York, in the Bronx. Our zip code had the highest percentage of patients in hospitals in New York City, which was the epicenter of the whole country and the epicenter of the world at the time. So we spent 4 weeks of no traffic and only ambulances. So the reality of this pandemic struck all of us in very profound ways. But I think what's important for all of us is that this is kind of a meeting of time, our own personal lifetime and the life of the times we live in. And a few months ago, we would never have thought that we would have gone through so much in such a short period of time. And we have to ask ourselves, what are the principles, what are the things that kind of hold us together? What are the lifelong impacts that help create our identity and help create our response to reality? And I say that there's probably four major aspects in my own life, and you could probably ask yourself that question for yourself. What are the impacting identities that have formulated your identity? And for myself, first of all, like Sandra and the Foundations, the Bread of Life, we come from the Christian tradition, and though I am open to the wisdom of other traditions, it is my relationship with Jesus and through symbol and theology and ritual that it continues to enrich my life. And that means that whole issue of reading the gospel in the light of the day that we live in is very important. I have found that for many of my directees, they are going back to the gospel, back to the Beatitudes, back to the core of what we call ourselves a Christian. Sandra mentioned the fact of my background in Jung. For 40 years, I've been a student of Jung and analytical psychology and his thinking, with varying degrees, but also, constant reading and reflection and working with men and women in spiritual direction. I believe his language that I've used in your conference that you listened to is really key to understanding the bridge between the inner psychic world and the outer world that we live in, including such things as collective shadow, consciousness, this language that helps us articulate what does it mean to be here in this historical moment. Thirdly, the influence of being a spiritual director and listening to people, men and women. At the present moment, I have directees from the age of 25 to 90, with about every kind of life experience you can imagine. And it is always so humbling to listen to people articulate their human journey and how the human condition is so in sync with the divine awakening, that we go through periods of testing, we go through periods of darkness, we go through dark nights. And all the while, God is pulling us, initiating us to the next stage. And I think one of the great mysteries that we were talking about in the CD is God provides a voice and provides us the aptitude and the ability to listen to that voice, and then gives us a will to either enact it or not. Or we can turn off the channel completely and suppress listening to that inner voice and move towards moralisms or addictions or other ways of learning to live. And as a spiritual director, I witness people's enthusiasm, ambivalence, resistance, attraction, repulsion of that divine voice. And each of us at this historical moment has to say, what is my ethical, and this is what we talked about in the thing, that my ethical responsibility to pay attention to that voice and enact it in some way. And the fourth one, which has been very powerful in my life, is 23 years living in multiracial, ethically diverse, and immigrant communities in Chicago and Oakland, in New York and Manhattan, and now in the Bronx. and being formed by listening to other people's experiences that are so different from mine as being a white male, and learning the compassion and also the collective darkness that has erupted in the last few weeks in our own consciousness once again, of the deep collective shadow of racism and hatred and oppression. I feel like, I don't know about you folks, but at the end of 1 week, I'm exhausted of all the things that have gone on in a week. It's hard to catch up from day to day. I feel in the last 2 weeks since I've taped the presentation, I have to almost update us once again with what's happening now. And the first thing is, I mentioned the fact about Kairos time and Kronos time. Kronos time meaning kind of the ordinary, everyday, whatever. Well, in the last few months, every day has been Kairos time. You can't take a breath before you know you've got a next thing that's shifting or moving or erupting. And just when you think, well, it can't get worse, it does get worse. Or when you think, well, that's over with, it's really just turning the corner and we're beginning again. So Kairos time is awakening time. It's also a very important temptation time to try and go back to sleep. And I hear this ambivalence. I can't handle anymore. I don't want to listen to this anymore. I've had enough. I don't know if any of us have the luxury to be able to walk away from reality and to say we've had enough. This is the Kairos time that we're in. In the last 4 months, it's been boiling over and it's not finished. There's much more ahead. And I think we have to be spiritually prepared to know that this is not finished and we don't know how it's going to end, and we have to stay alert. Certainly in the last even few days, the shifting sands on the pandemic is once again reawakening the fact that this is not going to sleep for the summer. We're not in a second wave. We haven't even finished the first wave. And we have new outbreaks and unfortunately in California, a large outbreak in the southern part of the state, which is going to affect millions of people. We're not out of the woods. And as much as we can be bored with it, Americans tend to be bored very easily. We want it over with. We want something more exciting. The news cycle of 24 hours is like, goes from one thing to the next. We're going to have to learn that this is bored or not bored. We have to be attentive. And I think it's showing our collective immaturity and our resistance to doing what's right for any length of time. Just before I came on here, they announced in Europe that Americans are not allowed to travel in Europe this summer. Okay, now Algeria can, but the United States can't. If you look at the list of the countries that are now capable of traveling, and you say to yourself, there's something wrong here. It's we and Brazil and Russia are excluded. That's pretty scary. Secondly, in the last few weeks, we've had this re-envisioning of the use of our resources for policing and for changing in our cities and states and counties. And all of a sudden, that which was kind of like on hold or, the same old things were repeated. This time, there is a real movement towards demilitarizing our police, especially in communities, racially vulnerable communities. After the horrific death of George Floyd and others, we're beginning to recognize the systemic, ongoing, cyclic racism that has impacted every community in America. And that this is not going to change unless we make changes. The third thing is, can you believe that yesterday Mississippi changed its flag? Since 1897, it was reinstated after Reconstruction to place white power in Mississippi, and it's been there for 123 years. All of a sudden, by a nearly unanimous vote, that the state flag was going to change. We're rediscovering that we are still fighting a war that ended centuries ago, but that the wounds and the traumas and the events of that historical event continue. I think we realize today that as a multi-racial and multi-ethnic immigrant community, that the changes ahead are going to be painful, but necessary. And the powers of regression, we have to be careful, will be very attractive to some, and not to allow those powers of regression to take hold. And lastly, the economic sufferings of people. People are really suffering. A lot of the aid for businesses ended yet today. And they're not going to get any more aid unless something happens. We are going to have, not only do we have millions of people unemployed, we're going to have millions of people in desperate need. Our local parish that I belong to, before the pandemic, had a food bank where generally between 80 and 90 families would come on a Friday for food. Last week, there were 425 that came for assistance. Okay? People are really hurting. And we are going to be in the midst of a culture that has been so superfluous with our resources that we're going to realize that ordinary people are hurting, but those that are really hurting from this pandemic are going to need lots of help. And then lastly, and I don't really need to say much about this, is that the political chaos is more chaotic than ever. And I am tired of the word unprecedented. I don't know about you, but every day we hear unprecedented. It's the most used word. I think most of us are emotionally exhausted from the chaos and for the dysfunction and the dramas. I feel like I am part of a radical dysfunctional family that only lives in dramas. That you can't talk to one another, you can't negotiate things. We're in this massive, dramatic lack of leadership and systems that are causing us to really feel alienated. Half of my family lives in Canada, and half of my family lives here. Our Canadian friends and family are very concerned for us because they don't understand what's happening. That the stability that they saw us is like completely lacking. They have brought the Kronos virus almost to zero at this point. And they're watching us, in chaos and can't believe what's happening. Given all of what I just said, on top of what I said those 4 hours, you can see why we have to stay awake. and why the temptation of anesthetizing the anxiety is always there. It's interesting that the amount of alcohol consumed by Americans has dramatically increased during the pandemic. And I think it's very logical. At the end of the day, all you want to do is take 2 or 3 glasses of wine to kind of soothe the agony. It's like, I don't want to feel this anymore. But we are in a time which we have to allow ourselves to be disturbed. If we don't make changes unless we're disturbed. And, you know, I think I'm just going to quickly review the 4 sections in relationship to this introduction to see where we are now. You know, in session 1, in the first CD, I was speaking about the eruptions that come from beneath the surface. The unconscious is always with us. You know, when people have said to me that, you know, working with the unconscious is the work of therapy. Yes, it is. But it has been the work of religion and spirituality from time eternal, because the unconscious is always with us. So to presume that I'm not dealing with the unconscious by not naming the unconscious is like saying I don't have to believe that my heart is beating to make it beat. You know, it's like, it's not logical. It's always there. The unconscious is always with us. And it is always there having an impact on us. And to remain conscious is always an effort. We can so easily, and right, for so many of you, right, if you spent years doing therapy about childhood issues, and you think, okay, this is emptied out now. Some new situation will occur, and all of a sudden you are back to 8 years old. And you say to yourself, oh my God, I thought I'd emptied that sewage. I thought that was all gone. And as Jung so profoundly said, the unconscious is always unconscious. As much as we think that just because I have made changes that I'm totally conscious is an illusion. And what's important for us individually and collectively is to recognize that consciousness only grows when the unconscious is brought forward. So, you know, these demonstrations and the violence and the eruption and everything, all of that was there the day before Floyd was murdered. It was all there. It was just sitting. But all you needed was one thing to erupt that collective unconscious experience. All of a sudden, it erupted. So that event didn't create it. What that event was allowed it to become exploded. Unfortunately, at times when it explodes, it gets messy. And as we also know in our own personal lives, right? When the unconscious explodes, it can get very messy. It's not always nice and clean. So we are being invited personally and collectively to look at these festering issues within us and around us and to allow them to come forward, not to be suppressed, but to be recognized as to what needs to be healed, what needs to be reconciled, and what needs to be outgrown and integrated into a new identity. What was it that propelled hundreds of thousands of people, young and old, Black and white, Hispanic, new immigrants, old immigrants, to come forward, to take action, I think it was because all of a sudden there was this moment of eruption that said, I can no longer bear this within. I need to express it. A reminder also that so often we think consciousness is about insight. Consciousness is not insight. Consciousness has a dimension that is insight, but it's actually, insight is the least operative form of consciousness. Because what consciousness really is an awakening of our total being to an issue, to a place. Have you ever noticed that when something gets stirred in you and you're not aware of it, but it triggers off something from your past, your hands begin to sweat, you feel that little anxiety, your breath is tempered in some way, you feel anxious, your body holds the memory and holds your consciousness. So I think so many people took to the streets because their consciousness had to move from insight into some kind of embodied experience. It needed to be released. Okay? A reminder that when we're talking about the growth in consciousness, it has little to do with education. I've known very conscious individuals, very spiritually, deeply spiritual people who don't have degrees in consciousness. They live it out. Okay? So education, because we know too many people, right, that are highly educated and are totally asleep. So it's, we presume that people that have no education are unconscious. That is not the truth. We have people in charge of things that are rather unconscious. The other thing is, and this was a topic that I hope was relevant to your own experience, is this whole issue of looking at conscience again. Conscience. And that so often conscience has been relegated to, the super ego and, old patterns of family behavior and shoulds and oughts and maybes. Jung made it very clear, and I in the section that I did on conscience and the quotes that I gave you from Jung, that he felt that the difficulty in the 1930s when Nazism was rising and the collective darkness was coming forward and this very darkness was erupting, that institutions were not able to hold that darkness and transform it. Either they became seduced into the very thing itself, or they became powerless in being able to have a prophetic voice. That simply traditionally being good in the old understanding is not enough for the new ethic. He makes us aware that the individual path before us must take a prophetic voice to our social lives as well as to our personal lives. I'm very taken by Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, in which, in that long Baptist Black tradition of uniting justice with the gospel and justice with the Exodus story and God with those that are oppressed. I mean, this is part of a tradition of the Christian life of going to, I think what we have today is the danger, as we have had in our past, religion being attempted to be used by politicians to support immoral behavior. And we saw that in front of St. John's Church in Washington, a good example of this. But also how politicians are using mega churches as being a place to support what I believe, as a Christian, are values that are antithesis to the Gospels, whether it's the attitude towards immigration, attitude towards the poor. They certainly don't parallel the Gospel that I read. When Jung's insight into conscience, he made a distinguish between what he called moral conscience, that's the superego, and ethical conscience. And ethical conscience is that awareness of deep voice within us created not from peace, but created from conflict. You know, too many people are looking for consciousness in order to experience bliss. Consciousness is created through conflict. It's not created in bliss. That's a misnomer. And I use the examples of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Franz Jagerstrada in their lives of two Christian men who made a decision that they could not. They would rather sacrifice their life than to swear allegiance to someone that they felt was the incarnation of evil. And I think during our time, we have to ask, am I living from an ethical place where I cannot suppress that voice? Or am I just trying to put on the performance of being the good person and not create conflict? And when I read the Gospels, Jesus created a lot of conflict, and he died because of conflict. So to me, this is, you know, we have to be challenging this issue. Session 3, I reviewed the collective shadow that's ripping us apart in these days. And it's really embarrassing, but it's like our collective shadow has been ripped off and exposed. I have a friend in Northern Ireland. She has a son who's half Black, and she speaks of, you know, the fear of raising this Black boy in a culture similar to our own that has a lot of racist overtones. Now, what's important is, rather than feeling shame that our shadow is exposed, this is an incredible opportunity. What would happen if we decided that this is good news and that finally our undercurrents of darkness are being exposed so that we can reconcile the past and also make adjustments not to return to that unconsciousness? The exposure of the shadow is not bad news. It's bad news for our persona. It's not bad news for our Christ center, because Jesus identifies with the truth. He is not only speaks the truth, he is the truth. I use the term revolution. A lot of people feel uncomfortable with that word because it indicates anarchy or collective chaos. The paradox of it is, if we don't face the revolution, then the dark revolution may come. There's the revolution of light, and there's the revolution of darkness. And the revolution of light is that we turn our lives around, that we actually move into a life of conversion. In the last section about mystical hope and the vision of the social mystic, simply what the social mystic is, it is the person who unites their inner world with their outer expression. It is a mysticism that is incorporated, incarnated, that our hopes become reality by living from this place. And I think in Christian theology, the reign of God is really what the social mystic is about. It's where the poor are fed, where the naked are clothed, where the orphan and the widow are taken care of. It is a vision of a world different from this world. But it is not so only because they've gone inside, but they've gone inside to come outside in a different way. And lastly, I just want to say that the call is not only to be insular, but to create community. New ways of being community, new ways to network, new ways of being together, which is a very important process that Bread of Life has been a part of in the last 20 years and continues to form circles of community over and over again for communication, for reconciliation, for mysticism, for spiritual direction. That Jung said in 1942, in the darkest hour of the Second World War, that what was necessary were contemplative communities of justice, and they would become the lights on tops of mountains. And I think this is what we're trying to do, create communities of light on the top of the darkness of mountains, to shed the fact that there is hope in the world. So that's the kind of overview.
Don, thank you so much for framing it so succinctly and beautifully, and opening the terrain with the continuing reflection on what is moving among us, around us, within us, in this extraordinary Kairos moment. From Barry, how do you become engaged without being taken over or flooded?
Okay, so do you remember when I used the dream from my directee about the Christmas Eve, and she had the light and she was bringing the light to others. The obstacles, okay, was continually moving, couldn't hold on to the light. I think we get flooded with too much information and not enough integration. You know, because I can get flooded with too much, and you know what it is? Oftentimes, when you watch things, you're watching the same thing over and over again. That's when you get flooded. I think what's really important for me is, and it's so counterintuitive, in order for not to drown, you've got to slow it down. I always use the example on the Jersey Shore during the summer. There have been these, you know, when there's an undertow and somebody gets carried out, okay? They tell them as they're being flooded, okay, don't move, stay still, and the current will bring you to a safe place. The current will carry you to a safe place. So what is counterintuitive to the ego that when I'm flooded, I need more. Actually, when you're flooded, you need less. Okay, you don't need more information. What you do, emptiness, some contemplative space, emptiness, working with being centered and choosing where and what to do and not be responsible for everything you know. This is the danger I see for people today. We take on too much responsibility for everything that we know.
Thank you. From Tutti Franzen, could you talk about the resistance to allowing the discomfort to come to consciousness?
All of us want change. None of us want to change. You know, you pay $150 to speak to a therapist and you're in resistance to the last 2 minutes until it breaks open. I think we should not at all be naive to the depth of resistance that all of us have to fundamental change. Most of us are interested in adaptation, adjustments, but we use the word transformational without really understanding the cost of what that means. The cost means there is a change that happens with you that goes all the way to your DNA. You literally become a new person. Most of us want to be successful and safe and change, but change to become better, not necessarily to be more authentic. So, you know, the resistance is sometimes we don't know how deeply we are unconsciously committed to not changing.
My saying about that is, I want to be transformed, so long as I don't have to change this or this or this.
Right, or influence this relationship or let go of that job or, you know, all the things that impact me.
From Susan Oxley, we are also facing climate disruption, which will add to the crises we face and the humanitarian issues that are occurring. Can you comment on this?
All I can say is you're right. Nature has its own laws. And the ego tries to manipulate nature unsuccessfully. I was just watching the news at, this morning, and this huge cloud of dust and sand from Africa, okay, is here, right, on our borders. Isn't it interesting that it's over Houston right now? And they said this is going to cause more of a problem because of people's respiratory issues and, and the pandemic and all that kind of stuff. And I think we have to look at all this as a whole, as a complete whole, as a species. We're not talking about just America. We're not talking about just us. This is an awakening of the species, that if we don't awaken, then we are all of us are in danger. And there is this bizarre synchronicity happening right now between how nature is really impacting us in ways in which we're realizing that we don't have complete control over nature. Nature has control over us. So I think along with the awakening comes a humility. And are we willing to take the humility from nature to learn? or is our ego greed going to try to overcome it?
Thank you. From Cheryl Trainer, what are important questions to ask regarding discerning the voice of God?
Well, the first thing is, if it's loud, if a voice is louder and aggressive, it's not of God. If it's intrusive and dominating, it's not of God. The voice of God is always that inner center that speaks some fundamental truth in very simple ways that has implications of choice. Now, because we are created to have conversation, communication with the divine. No matter where you come from, no matter what tradition you come from, that's part of our innate, what makes us human. So once you have heard this voice, then one has to contemplate it and open it up to discern what is it saying. I love the example that I gave around that Austrian layman who had that dream about the train, okay? And when he woke up from the dream, he heard also a rush of wind and a bright light, two direct symbols of God's presence. And what he heard in himself was, this is a choice. If I get on the train, I'm becoming this Nazi, and it's going to hell, okay, and bringing everybody with it. Or if I don't get on the train, that's when I am going to become a Christian. It became that clear. Now, that had to be a very profound experience to literally dominate his consciousness even to death itself. So when we have a sense of the voice speaking, we have to really hold on to that as if God is literally speaking to us.
So from Joel and Lane Shipper, a comment. It seems there is a political message in the dream in the church, another dream, about lighting the candles. A powerful message of the need now to gather, find a new way, abandon the old way, and find the collective will to make a change.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the reason why I asked this directee to use her dream, because I felt it had a collective message. It obviously has a personal message, but it has a collective message as well. And that, you know, we are at the witching hour. It's midnight. We're at that cusp between two different realities. And there are people attempting to bring that light forward. But there's resistance to the light because people want to hold on to old things, and they're moving too much to allow the light to remain. So those are, I think that's something that we can collectively meditate on and say, is God trying to say us something from this?
From Sandy John, how do I distinguish or experience the difference between the ongoing grief for the ongoing death of the ego in the awakening process, which is necessary, and the despair and hopelessness I often feel about my ego and my complicity in systemic evil, which seems narcissistic?
Okay. One diminishes the ego centeredness, which actually strengthens the ego. Here's the paradox. When I'm letting go of ego, I'm letting go of egocentricity. I'm letting go of my self-centeredness. The paradox of it is, I'm not becoming less. I'm becoming stronger to be in relationship with more. There's the paradox. There's a difference between letting go of egocentricity, which means I'm in charge of everything and I have to be in charge of everyone, okay, to recognizing that an ego is strong when it says, I can't do that. Or I am a limited creature, I can't burn myself out. It takes strength to do that. So the paradox of it is, the ego becomes stronger the more you let it go of being narcissistic. And the depression, the dark, when the ego gets depressed about its choices and its history and all that kind of stuff, that's the path to weakening the ego. When the ego gets weakened, it can't choose God because it's lost in itself. It can't choose something greater than itself because I'm so bad, or I'm a part of the system and I get really down on myself. That's not the loss of ego. That's reinforcing the egocentricity that it's all about me. So it's, this is a very paradoxical place that in spiritual direction you got to work, that you don't diminish or eliminate the ego, you strengthen it so that it cannot be the center any longer.
Like the reformation of the ego in service to the
to the deeper self. Yeah. And we have to heal that other part.
From Judy Robinson, this is also wonderful and it's enormous. What guidance can you provide on where do we start?
Well, I think everybody has to start where they are. It's like there is no place to start except for wherever you are. And the question is, for all of us, we have to assess, am I being faithful to my prayer life? Am I being faithful to, remember I mentioned in the CDs about the review of the day is not about the examen of conscience, what did I do wrong, but the examen of consciousness. Where did I avoid today? Where did I accept the invitation? When was I engulfed and I needed to withdraw? In other words, for all of us, this is a dance that we have to learn, and everybody has an individual dance because we all have a different vocation. Now, something that I mentioned on the CDs that I think is also true across the board, right, is a lot of us are feeling that my life has prepared me for this moment. So if you just take that fact, if you think that's true, that my life journey has prepared me for this moment, my maturity, my education, my whatever, then you ask yourself, the question is, what can I contribute at this moment to this Kairos?
From Lucy Shalifor, would you say more about the function of conscience?
The function of conscience, right.
Yes.
The function of conscience is about making sure that my orientation is moving towards an integrity of life. That my deepest desires of who I am is orientated in my choices. So conscience is the voice that supports my discernment of individuating into the total person that I was meant to be by God. And it kind of helps guide me into that passage. sometimes when I go off there, right, I go against myself, then the conscience may come up as like a warning, a firewall, okay? Or if you're really seeking the truth, it will guide you into what the right choice is. So I think in the example that I gave of Franz, I think he was wrestling deeply inside with his integrity that he wanted to do God's desire. So what the conscience did was provide him a symbolic representation of his choice, of his greatest desire versus his desire for survival. And it gave him the clarity necessary. So I think conscience is, and from a Jungian perspective, it is the awakening of the transcendent function in the psyche, which becomes the communicator of the deeper self. So the voice that comes of conscience is not that of the ego. It comes from the deeper self and then informs the ego, because the ego is the choice maker.
From Mary Becker, the shadow has been primarily ripped off of white people. It's all too evident to people of color. How do we bridge that gap?
By accepting the truth, being humble enough to, exposed enough to recognize that this has been a societal, systemic injustice that has been done through generations, and to recognize our collective sinfulness, our collective ignorance, and also to recognize that shame does not help. Shame paralyzes, okay? Real change happens when the awakening of like, now I know, I cannot make believe that I don't know. How does this change how I live and make choices? So this moment has taken the scab off of, well, it's not that bad, I don't know, blah, blah, blah. All of a sudden that scab has come off. And what was very, I'm sure it was the same in California, amazingly, like in Brooklyn and the Bronx, in those mass demonstrations, at least half the people were white. This was very different than anything historically in the past. So it's almost as if like this time something happened where people really saw.
From Jean Holston, it seems like this is a time for risk and putting our lives on the line for the values we say we believe. I imagine this looks different for different people. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that looks very different for different people, because I think we all have to be responsible for the vocation that we live and the gifts that we have. And if our gift is in social work, if our gift is in education, if our gift is in finance, if our gift, whatever, use the gifts and the development that you have to be of service. So I don't think there is a universal. I really think what the universal is discernment. We are all called to discern. But the end result of each discernment is going to be different.
From Linda Smith, it's like the hallmark of trauma therapy. Less is more, slower is faster.
Absolutely. I think you are completely correct, because I think in some ways we are healing from a large collective trauma.
From Barbara Pombo. Oh, did you have more to say, Don? I think you froze.
No, I think You
Okay.
froze. I didn't hear you.
We're taking turns freezing. I
Yes.
didn't know if you had more to say or I can go on to the next.
No, I think you can go on to the next.
Okay, from Barbara Pombo. Any practical ideas, projects, outreach that can be built in local church communities? Often from the pulpit, there is only a plea and prayer for peace in our country.
Yes. I think what we need to do is to create what I called, and I think was in your packet, contemplative communities of resistance. How do we bring people together in a format of prayer, study, and action? Because I think what happens in the larger societal religious community is that there's too easily a relationship between nationalism and religion. Okay, and I think that chemistry has worked a lot in this country. And that's breaking down among some denominations or some aspects of denominations, but that's been a long, tradition of nationalism and religion going hand in hand. So I think these, like in the 70s and 80s in Central America, when you have, communities gathering to do scripture and justice issues, communities of faith, I think we need contemplative communities of individuals coming together to discern from a place of depth, actions that the community feels called to.
From Shirley, social mystic. You mentioned the reign of God through activities as in caring for the poor, orphan, widows. Does that include immigrants as well? Since we in the USA do not appear to be operating in this type of scriptural living, what effect do you think this has on the USA?
Well, I think what's important to recognize that politicians, their main concern is not the reign of God. Because the reign of God always comes from the voice of the prophet. Okay? When, it's kind of like the reign of God likes to play games with turning things around. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. The paradoxes of Christ, the good Samaritan, the oxymoron, okay? The good immigrant, the holy immigrant. Jesus was always playing with oxymorons and paradoxes to turn things around. I think for us to be faithful to the gospel, we have to do the same thing to our own society and political system. Where are we prophetic about the reign of God? And that means standing for social justice as well as charity. What happens in most religious contexts, right? If a religion runs a soup kitchen, they're called heroic. But if a group asks why people remain poor so that they have to go to a soup kitchen and challenge the system, they're called socialists. So we've got to recognize that, as says in the Psalms, charity and justice must kiss. I think that's the challenge of today. You need charity, yes, because there are people immediately in need. But then you also have to work for justice as to eliminate some of the reasons why these people are constantly in need.
Comment from Liz Padula. Learning how to prioritize has been important to me. I find that setting boundaries helps me to assimilate too much information.
I think that's very timely. And we have to protect ourselves from too much media, too much information, too much repetition, because that can be used by the inner voices of diminishment and depression. So you have to be very careful.
From Shirley, call to create community. Are you in agreement with Willie Jennings' book on the Christian imagination as it referred to create community in new ways? Isn't it interesting that the scientists working on antibodies for the virus, they found that most of the variant of virus in the USA, New York, comes from Europe, and the mutation that occurred in Europe seems to be more aggressively spreading in the USA.
All I can say is I'm not familiar with that particular book, but I do feel the need for new forms of community. Almost like, healthy cells. I don't think you can change the entire parish or the entire congregation or the entire whatever, but you can create healthy cells, which then feel more empowered to be able to be spokespersons.
From Donnie, when the unconscious erupts and we're prompted to take action against injustice, how do I stay conscious of the inevitable tensions that will come with living in paradox? How do we know if we're not going on a path of an opposite extreme? It seems that being in constant communication with all sides would be essential.
Yes, I totally agree. And also to recognize that one of the dangers is that we go in compensation, we go from one extreme to another. And that's not what anything whole really means. It's not going to the revolution to create the opposite extreme. We always have to be aware that of what Jung calls the temptation to inflation. And that's the reason why, if you're going to do this kind of work, you need to be grounded in your own material. You should be accountable to somebody, like in a spiritual direction relationship or a supervisor relationship, to recognize. Recently, I had a encounter with a young man that's, very involved in these things, and the entire session and supervision was his inflation. That he was. I think what happens is you have to be very careful that you have to know your own shadow to ground you. Otherwise, you become the very thing that you learn to hate. Okay, so you become the opposite, which is really the same thing. So I think what's important is one of the CDs that I did was called Inner Work for Social Justice. And because I recognize that unless you're doing your inner work, your social justice can be a place of working unconsciously your own shadow material. And then someone else becomes a victim of your shadow. And I think it takes inner work to do social justice. There needs to be a parallel between the two, because otherwise the other simply becomes the projection of your own dark side.
From Ann Burke, do you think we can collectively hold our current darkness on a systemic level in the US? How, or should we ask for help from the rest of the world and those that are staying awake consciously?
That's a phenomenal question, because because of my work, I have traveled all over the world. And I have friends and colleagues all over the world. They see us more clearly than we see ourselves. All you have to do, those of you that travel, is that when you leave the country and you see the country from that angle, boy, does it look different. And we have to let go of our arrogance. Like when the pandemic first started, the World Health Organization wanted to give us, testing materials. And of course, we refused. We needed that testing. But in our arrogance, we should be the ones that are always in charge. We should be telling others what to do. And at this moment, we're being humiliated in the pandemic of recognizing that we messed it up royally. And we are now, I mean, I have friends from Ireland who called me and said, boy, the news makes it look horrible what's happening there. And I said, well, yeah, it is pretty horrible. And everybody that I've heard has said, how can the wealthiest country, and I said, you know, we have a lot of wealth and we have a lot of power, but that doesn't mean that the people are taken care of. We have the worst health system for the poor. We have the worst health system for people that are on the margins. And they're the most vulnerable and are dying from the pandemic. So we may have tremendous wealth and power, but that doesn't mean, what this is showing us is that a lot of our values are completely misconstrued. That we don't have a healthy population.
From Kathleen McDonald. In the written handout, you talked about creating communities, beginning with contemplative prayer and study and then moving to action. But I find it often doesn't work like that. The contemplative groups keep wanting to pray and study or discover that they're being called to different actions. I find that groups often gather for action and are in need of help in being able to share deeper reflection on the strategies and actions they have taken or are contemplating taking. And these groups are often not uniquely Christian or even skilled in spiritual reflection, but may in fact be social mystics. It seems that skills for enhancing this kind of dialogue can be a real contribution here.
That's great. I also think, well, you know, and I think what happens is, if you have a lot of introverts coming together, they're going to be very interested in contemplation and reading and reflection. But they have to get off their duff and use their extroversion to do something. And this is where the way that I have suggested to people is, from the very beginning, the discernment is, what are we called to do? Okay, so that the prayer and the reading is guided towards what our intention is to do. So I totally agree. You can get lost in a contemplative maze. You can read yourself to death, and then by the end, there's no activity that takes place. I think you have to begin with the intention of creating a community for an action, and then pray and prepare for that action. And that the commitment is, we are going to do it together, not individually. It's not an individual discernment, it's a collective discernment. So I think it has to do with leadership in those groups. And I agree, you can take a group of people that are doing similar work and bring them together to form community and go in reverse to integrate some of those things. I think only people in action without discernment is not good. Discernment without action is not discernment. So it tends to be, how do we integrate all those pieces?
From David Brock. What are the implications for organized religion in the midst of all this? What can we not go back to? What hints of the future church are being manifested?
I think the church has to overcome its desire to survive as it is. There's too much attachment to survival. Either survival in numbers, survival in money, and survival in success, and I think there are many different new ways of expressing our lives together as community that may not look the same. I'm distressed, to be honest, with these huge mega churches that are too aligned with the values of a society without questioning the values of that society. And I think what we have to do is to integrate the prophetic within the institution. The institution tends to always want to survive itself. But you know, the danger of this moment is if the institution decides to survive for itself, that's the best way to die, because there's no new life there. So if there's any real leadership in religious institutions, is how do we bring the prophetic into this? Because I'm working with a lot of, right now, millennials, and they have no interest in the institution because the institution is not the format or the focus of where real religious or social change is happening.
From Lori Gordon, and we're in our last 4 minutes before we take a break. So I'd like to at least get this and maybe one more question in. An excellent recent article by Nafis Ahmed demonstrates the correlation between systemic racism and the systemic degradation of Earth's systems. Mm-hmm. Both see the other, whether human or creature or ecosystem, as object rather than the other as subject, precious, and of value in his or her own right. The quality of our contemplative seeing seems essential. How do we more consciously invite this awakening to the other as beloved and to the interconnectedness of all beings in our lives, of course, but also in our communities of faith?
Time is a very precious thing. To me, it's the discernment of what do I do with my time. How much do I spend on my iPad? How much do I entertain myself passively? You know, how much time do I spend in nature? With others? I totally agree with the statement that that person said, you know, but I think it's how do I tithe my time so that I am not relegated and oppressed by technology that takes me away from real people, real events, and real nature. I mean, I just find it incredible that, you know, everybody goes jogging, but they're all connected. They don't listen to nature. They don't, you know, they could be anywhere. They could be in a gym or in nature, it doesn't matter. So I think it's suggesting to people to tithe their time differently.
And our last question from Kevin. In moving towards what we are passionate about and what repulses or discomforts us for spiritual growth, how do we approach what repulses us in a healthy way?
What we is as great of a teacher as what attracts us. So what repulses us is an invitation. That what repulses us is some dimension that I don't want to see, don't want to encounter, don't want to notice. And some of the greatness and the leper. Francis was offended by the leper, but it wasn't until he embraced the leper that he had a profound conversion experience. So what offends us and whatever is a gateway to conversion in some way. We have to see it as an invitation, not a repulsion.
Coming back together to speak a little bit about what's been evoked in you and what's stirring in you, it actually begins to take on more shape and more form. I have a friend who's a native Arabic speaker, and those of you who know me have heard me say this before, but it's so appropriate to what it is to be human in the work of consciousness, that in Arabic, the root of the word human means the forgetful. We forget. We fall back asleep. So the act of taking some time to reflect, to take how the work that Dawn has been doing and speaking to speaks into our lives like a Lectio Divina of our life, and to reflect that to other people to be witnessed actually helps us with the remembering. So welcome back. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dawn, who will speak to what all of this means for the future, for the questions that we need to be holding. So Dawn?
Okay, thank you. What we designed for our closing for today was really a series of contemplative questions that I'm going to provide for you for reflections. And you know what's interesting with this, in order for you not to get neurotic about writing the questions down, we have already designed all the questions and a handout to be sent to you tomorrow. Okay, so there's no need to take notes. If you want to write a word or a phrase that comes up from the question, okay, because the questions will come back to you to stay with for a longer period of time. Okay, these questions are obviously not meant to be answered. They're meant to be provocative. And they're not meant to be all answered. It's like what touches you, what energizes you, what stirs you that you want to stay with. Because deep periods of action also need deep listening. Because if we just react, we're not going to go anywhere. So there has to be contemplative listening, self-knowledge, acquired discernment in order to move to action. So I'm going to be giving you these questions kind of as a meditation, and just stay with what gets evoked in you. Again, you can journal. You don't have to write the questions because the questions are all were typed out and being given to you tomorrow. You know, I've mentioned several times, including today, a very important question is like, has my life prepared me for this moment? And if so, how is this moment forming me as I'm forming the moment? How am I being formed as well as forming? The dream of my directee suggests a divine birth, a Christmas Eve, a new center. Is this divine birthing process pushing me in a new way to live in a new way of being? What are the birth pangs of this for me? How am I suffering the painful aspects of this birth? How are my emotions and body being influenced by what's happening around me? Am I listening to my emotions and my body, my fatigue, my pain? Can I hold the reality of our world in contemplative openness? Walter Burckhardt defined contemplation as a long, loving look at the real. Do I look at the real through the eyes of love, longing, gazing? Can I trust the invitation for being undefended and open, and to have an open heart? How have I wrestled with conscience recently? Is there an aspect of conflict within me that I need to hold and lovingly respond to? Is ethical conscience replacing moral conscience in my life? Thomas Merton, whose picture is right behind me, used to say that it's nearly impossible for a good person to convert. How am I being called to conversion beyond goodness, but into wholeness? Is part of my spiritual discipline not only prayer and meditation, but social action and charity? Do I encounter Christ in the world around me? Dorothy Day said, "Those who cannot see Christ in the poor are atheists." In what way do I resist seeing Christ in those that I am resistant to see them in? Do I ever get seduced in a sleepy conscience, believing that God only wants to comfort and not disturb? Franz Jagerstrader listened to a dream and believed that God gave him a choice. What choices are God presenting to us? Is it clear what I'm choosing and not choosing? Am I willing to pay the cost of discipleship? In my inner world, do I pay attention to the voices of judgment and harshness towards myself? Or do I listen to the voice of compassion, understanding, and love? It is said that a paradox cannot be understood, and yet it can be lived. How does this apply to my own life? What is the paradox that's pushing me beyond ego? When I do my examen of consciousness and I review my life, do I see my life as a series of discernments, a series of choices moving ever closer to fulfilling God's desire in me? Who or what disturbs me at the moment? Do I have a hankering for security and the familiar? How am I letting go of the collective identity of my culture and religion? Am I brave enough to witness the shadow side of these realities? Can I be a loving prophetic voice of change to institutions that are rigidly holding on to the past? Dorothy Day invited us to be a revolutionary of the heart. What would that mean concretely in my life? Former teacher of mine, Angeles Arian, spoke of the fourfold path. You have to show up, you have to follow what has heart and meaning. But the third is to speak the truth. And lastly, to be detached to the outcome. In a period of history where the truth is so fragile, how do you seek the truth? Speak it and live it. Erich Neumann in 1948 said that there is a need for a new ethic, that the old ethic of being good is insufficient. We must now become awake. What does it look like in your own life to become more awake? There are two precious gifts at this moment in history. One is a soul friend that you can share, and the other is a community that can move towards transformation. In what ways are you supported by and challenged by soul friends in a community of invitation and sharing? So why don't you just spend some time with just beginning to notice what had either passion or resistance to stay with, and see what that's telling you.
I'm stunned by the questions. The largeness of them is something that can only be engaged in community. And it's a lifetime's work. I'm so appreciative of having them raised, Don. So thank you for that. And I'm struck also by the ways you keep bringing forward the need for discernment as a life process, as a lived process for the conscious journey of awakening. I don't think any of us will ever be awakened, but we will be awakening, and discernment is part of how that happens. There's movement, not easy resolution. There's movement, making ourselves available to that movement, discerning it, giving voice to it in the world, letting it be witnessed. This is all a part of our divine dance, our dance with the holy. I notice that a lot of folks are expressing leaving challenged. That sounds like a right movement of spirit. Some are coming and leaving with some disturbance, and it reminds me of the sign that Liz Ullman, who was executive director of Spiritual Directors International for many years, had on her door. Holy disturbance, welcome guest. Together, as we engage these kinds of currents around us, I do think there's an authentic hope that emerges that is very different from the optimism of which Don spoke in contrasting the two. And I do think that this is a profound invitation to the human family for ways of coming together. I can't imagine even beginning to explore these questions, which you will get in the mail and email tomorrow. We will be sending you links to further pieces of Dawn's work. We'll be sending you these questions so that you can continue to ponder them. And here at Bread of Life, we're going to be pondering how we might come together in small groups. Zoom is a gift, even if it's a sometimes tiresome gift of this new era in which we find ourselves. Might there be ways that we want to come together to hold those questions with intention so that we do not, in the rooting of the word Arabic, forget, or in the words of a friend of mine, steal it away. We have an aha and then we steal it away. We need one another to remember and put it on the ground in life and in the world. So we'll be exploring together some possibilities. So keep an eye out for that email. I'm aware that most of you have been able successfully to access Dawn's MP3s, the downloads. If for some reason that was difficult for you, we will continue to work with the Wansies and Yes Now Productions to make sure that that happens for you. Ben has been very faithfully on it during this time. He's our new office manager. So in just a moment, we'll close with prayer. Before we do that, Dawn, thank you. And I do speak, I do believe, for the community from the bottom of our hearts for your willing walking of the way and your willingness in radical generosity to extend your learnings, your leanings to the community, that we can continue to grow with it and participate in the realm of God that is both within and without, but requires our active participation. You are such a gift, and take a look at what's moved. So I hope, I hope you know the goodness of that. So with that, I'm going to repeat the prayer poem that we opened with, and just know how it touched you at the beginning and what it might signify to you now. Some folks have asked that that be included in the email tomorrow, and I'm happy to do that. So let me share screen. The fertile unnameable. There's a stillness hovering, wings spread wide over chaos, brooding over the formless dark womb of all creating, waiting, 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 wordless and wondering. A question mark hangs suspended. The unsung song and the ungrieved grief pregnant in the world's belly, gestating the yet unseen, yearning toward the unrevealed. There are no words in this place, only the pulse, the throbbing pulse, heartbeat of the holy, within and among, gathering strength, gathering life, gathering us into one magnificent, fertile breath for calling out the new creation. And so, friends, with blessings for your journey, we part company now, and may the Holy One continue to abide with and within us. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.